Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're diving into the absolute emotional climax and the brilliant literary mechanics of William Gibson's iconic play, The Miracle Worker. Specifically, we're zooming right into Act 3. This is the act where everything comes to a head, the tension is palpable, the stakes honestly couldn't be higher, and that emotional payoff is just absolutely legendary. But we aren't just going to sit here and recount the story. No, we're going to look closely at exactly how the author built this masterpiece and why it still resonates so deeply with us today.
So, to start us off, I want you to think about something for just a second. Who was your toughest teacher? Right? We've all had one. That one person who was totally uncompromising, who held you to a standard you probably thought was impossible at the time, and who just wouldn't let you get away with giving anything less than your absolute best. Well, sometimes those toughest teachers actually end up becoming our favorites. They teach us way more than just how to read or do arithmetic. They teach us how to become better people, helping us achieve more than we ever knew we could. And when it comes to the world of literature and history, Annie Sullivan is pretty much the ultimate example of this kind of teacher.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The toughest teachers. 2. The Act 3 miracle. 3. Unlocking symbolism. And 4. Discovering the theme.
Section 1. The toughest teachers.
Now, before we actually get to the miracle, we really have to understand the immense friction required to create it. Demanding teachers push us, for sure, but they also face massive resistance, and not just from the student, but from the whole environment around them. We see this central conflict clear as day in Annie Sullivan versus Helen's parents, Kate and Captain Keller. See, Annie demands consistent discipline. She has these incredibly high expectations, and she strictly enforces boundaries. On the flip side, Helen's parents have very few expectations of their daughter. They are driven entirely by pity. And ironically, that pity is exactly what's preventing Helen from learning. So as we enter Act 3, Annie's biggest struggle actually isn't even with Helen anymore. Her biggest battle is with Kate and Captain Keller, fighting against their natural instinct to pamper a child who desperately needs structure.
Section 2. The Act 3 miracle. So the third act kicks off with Helen and Annie moving out of the isolated garden house and heading back into the main Keller home. The protective bubble has officially popped, and the high-stakes action really shifts into overdrive. The tension immediately boils over into what we can call the dining room battle. As everyone tries to impose their will, Helen actually swings a water pitcher, spilling water everywhere. But Annie, she doesn't coddle her. No way. She insists on absolute obedience and table manners. Annie literally picks Helen up and forcefully makes her refill that pitcher. It is intense, it is raw, and it is entirely about establishing that absolutely crucial boundary.
And that brings us to a super important historical and narrative detail: Wawa. Wawa, or water, was actually the very first word Helen had ever spoken as a baby, right before the devastating fever and illness that took her sight and hearing. William Gibson deliberately places a massive water pump right in the foreground of the yard for a reason. It's the perfect poetic setting for Helen's ultimate breakthrough.
This yard setting perfectly illustrates the exact mechanics of that breakthrough. First, at the pump, Annie spells the word into Helen's hand. Second, Helen feels the cold, actual water rushing over her other hand. Third comes that crucial click. Helen finally associates Annie's spelling of the word with the physical substance itself. And fourth, the actual miracle occurs. Through her forced obedience to Annie's spelling exercise, Helen's completely isolated mind suddenly connects with the physical world around her. It's like a giant puzzle piece finally snapping into place.
The impact of this moment is just staggering for both of them. Yes, the miracle brings light into Helen's dark world, but Annie experiences her own profound internal change, too. The haunting voices from Annie's own past, they disappear forever at the end of the play. By acting as this tough, uncompromising teacher, Annie has truly become an agent of God, a literal miracle worker. And in doing so, her own internal struggles finally fade away.
Section 3. Unlocking symbolism.
All right, we've talked about the thrilling plot, right? The what of the story. Now let's dig into the how, the structural, literary elements that William Gibson carefully placed into this script to give it such incredible depth. To do that, we kind of need a quick refresher on symbolism. It's simply when an object represents something else. Authors use physical objects in a story to stand in for much larger, invisible ideas. Understanding this gives you the skeleton key to decode the play's deeper, hidden meanings.
And speaking of skeleton keys, the ultimate key to understanding this play: actual physical keys. In The Miracle Worker, physical keys equal authority and household control. It's brilliant in its simplicity, really.
Whoever happens to possess the physical keys is the person who is truly in charge of the household at that given moment. If you track the physical movement of these keys step by step, you get this perfect visual timeline of the shifting balance of power. Early in the play, we actually see Helen with the keys. A literal toddler is ruling the house. Then, during her massive temper tantrum in the breakfast scene, Annie takes charge of the keys, asserting her early dominance. Later in the afternoon, Helen gives the keys to her mother, reverting right back to her comfort zone of pity. But watch the Act 3 ending. The final movement. Helen takes the keys from her mother and hands them directly to Annie. By physically surrendering those keys at the climax of the play, Helen isn't just handing over a piece of metal. It symbolizes Helen completely, willingly accepting Annie as her authority figure. It perfectly illustrates Helen's ultimate growth and her submission to her toughest teacher. The visual object tells the entire emotional story without a single word needed.
Section 4. Discovering the theme.
We're going to zoom out one final time here to examine the overarching universal messages that William Gibson wanted us to take away from this incredible true story. First, let's define our terms so we know exactly what we're looking for. A theme is the meaning behind an author's writing. It's what the story says about life or human nature stated as a complete idea. A theme is not just what a story is about. That's a plot. Instead, a theme asks, what is the author trying to say about life? What do they actually want us to learn?
See, there's a very common academic confusion between a topic and a theme. A topic, like discipline, is just a subject matter, but a theme is a complete thought, like discipline is necessary for learning and growth. Do you see the difference there? A theme is always stated as a complete thought. It takes the topic and makes a definitive claim about it.
When we apply that to the play, the core themes of The Miracle Worker become incredibly clear. First, discipline is necessary for learning and growth. We see this in literally every interaction Annie has with Helen. Second, boundaries benefit learners. Helen was completely trapped in a chaotic world until Annie built walls she could navigate. And third, authority is healthy and necessary to prevent chaos. The struggles of Helen, Annie, and Captain Keller over those symbolic keys, they all serve to reinforce this universal truth. Without authority, the Keller household was an absolute disaster. But with proper, loving authority, a miracle was actually possible.
So I want to leave you with a final thought. Where do you see the themes of discipline and authority shaping your own learning and growth? Think about your toughest teachers. Think about the boundaries you've been given, or hey, perhaps the ones you need to set for yourself right now. Because William Gibson didn't just write this play to document history, he wrote it to show us that sometimes the hardest friction produces the brightest light. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope you look at your own toughest teachers in a whole new light.